You ought to have heard our cheer as he and General Beauregard rode down our line in a gallop, waving their hats and crying, "Boys, we've whipped them." But oh, bet the dead and wounded. God grant our country may never see such another field. These are the words of a Confederate soldier, writing to his cousin after the Battle of Bull Run, also known as First Manassas. Nearly 5,000 men would be killed or injured after less than 2 days fighting, a figure to be eclipsed by battles in the struggle to come. The situation for the United States in 1861 was dire. By February, 7 states had seceded from the Union, collaborating together to form the Confederate States of America. They operated on a staunchly pro-slavery economic platform and believed firmly that the election of Abraham Lincoln the previous year had opened the door for tyranny in the Union. The crux of Lincoln's belief was simple. The Union was to be preserved at all costs, although initially he believed it could be accomplished without abolition or bloodshed. "We are not enemies, but friends," he said in his inaugural address. "We must not be enemies." But the South would not be cowed. In the early months of 1861, Confederate President Jefferson Davis called for 100,000 recruits for a 1-year military contract, believing war was inevitable. After the 2-day shelling of Fort Sumter in April 1861, the last of the federal military installations in the South were under Confederate control. Although most had changed hands without open hostility, it was the sudden, uncompromising violence against a federal fortress that had the people of the Union finally calling for war. Although Sumter was of no real strategic importance, it held tremendous symbolic value, named as it was after a hero of the War of Independence. Facing pressure to end the war before it could properly break out, Lincoln asked for volunteers. He requested 75,000 over a 3-month period. Only 2 days after this declaration, Virginia would secede, followed shortly by several other states. There was an attitude of almost jubilation across the continent as the proverbial glove was thrown down. Culturally, both North and South believed themselves poised to eliminate the other's military capability in a matter of months, if not weeks. Morale was at an all-time high, and streams of volunteers ran to sign up for what would surely be the adventure of their lives. Union Major Sullivan Ballou would write, "I have no misgivings about or lack of confidence in the cause in which I am engaged, and my courage does not halt or falter. I know how strongly American civilization now leans upon the triumph of government, and how great a debt we owe to those who went before us through the blood and suffering of the Revolution, and I am willing, perfectly willing, to lay down all my joys in this life to help maintain this government and to pay that debt." It was the belief of both sides that the war would be ended with a single decisive blow, but not all were so fanatical. Robert E. Lee, who had fought in the Mexican-American War, and the man who, as a colonel, had captured the infamous John Brown, agonized over the decision to support secessionist Virginia. He would write that in his eyes, there was no greater calamity for the country than a dissolution of the Union. Abraham Lincoln asked him to lead the armies of the Union against the South. In response, Lee tendered his resignation in the Army, ultimately siding with his home state above all else. He was quickly put in command of the Confederacy's armies by an ecstatic Jefferson Davis. Ultimately, Richmond would be chosen as the capital of the Confederacy, which placed it remarkably close to Washington. "Forward to Richmond" was the cry of the day in the North, while many in the South urged their leaders to attack Washington immediately. Jefferson Davis refused, opting instead for a defensive war. The battle line had been drawn at Manassas Junction, and both sides knew it. In fact, several armies were being called up in and around that area. The junction itself was the key to a railroad line that would lead to the interior of Virginia, and was valuable territory indeed. The man whom Lee would choose to lead the army to defend the junction was a flamboyant general known as Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, the so-called hero of Sumter. It was his forces which had fired so brazenly on the holdouts at the fortress that April, and it was his ego, coupled with his ability to command troops, that propelled him into this new position of power. Beauregard grew up idolizing men such as Napoleon, and sought to ink his name in the ledger of history just like his hero. This desire for glory would find its way into the hearts of many who would fight in the coming war. In the North, the aging General Winfield Scott was selected to lead the Army of the Union in Lee's stead. Scott, a man who had fought the British in 1812, emphasized a grand plan known as the Anaconda Plan, in which the armies of the North would invade and hold key positions in the Confederacy, encircling and incapacitating the fledgling nation before it could establish itself. Scott appointed General Irvin McDowell to lead the Union Army to Richmond by way of Manassas Junction near the Bull Run River. McDowell was mainly chosen for the position due to the political influence of the Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase. While he was a brave man, and an able captain in the Mexican-American War, he had never commanded troops to the extent that he was now required. In fact, many generals on both sides had never seen combat, let alone led troops under fire. It was one of the factors for why the Civil War was as bloody as it was. A Civil War battle might end with almost 30% of its combatants involved killed or injured, a figure that is staggering by any standards. McDowell himself would complain about the greenness of his troops. Even the uniforms of 1861 were not yet standardized, with many on both sides sporting similar colors. This was due to the reliance on a militia system, where each state would clothe and arm its own troops. This general aura of inexperience and disorder would come to a head at Bull Run. McDowell's plan was straightforward. Union Major General Robert Patterson would drive the Confederates under Joseph Johnston away from nearby Harper's Ferry. McDowell's 30,000 men would feint attack Beauregard's 20,000, looping around its flank before the two Confederate armies could link up. On July 16, 1861, the plan was approved. McDowell's march began slowly, much slower than he had anticipated. McDowell was able to keep order, unlike some commanders who bore witness to looting and foraging. Among them was 40-year-old William Tecumseh Sherman, commanding the 1st Division's 3rd Brigade. The march demonstrated little save for the general laxity of discipline, he would write. For the advancing Union men, the day was boiling hot, and they grew frustrated that the rebels had yet to put up a serious fight. In fact, Beauregard had ordered his men not to engage, merely to scout the Union lines and fall back towards the main body of the Confederate army. McDowell ordered General Daniel Tyler to advance with 12,000 men to seize nearby Centerville, but ordered him not to trigger an engagement under any circumstances. Tyler, emboldened by the lack of resistance from the rebels, ignored him. He pushed on towards the front line over the Bull Run River. Beauregard's defensive line was 6 miles long, with the stone bridge to his left. As Tyler's men advanced, they were met with sporadic fire. Amidst the growing chaos, two groups of gray-clad soldiers met. "Who are you?" one group called. "Massachusetts men," the other replied. The first group, Confederate soldiers, turned and fired. There was heavy fighting around Blackburn's Ford, and neither side had clear view of each other. By this point, General Tyler elected to push on, ordering more guns to move to the hilltop and put fire on the Confederates. When the guns themselves came under attack, he sent the 12th New York and 1st Massachusetts to support. It was then that Confederate reinforcements under Jubal Early and James Longstreet arrived and drove them back. Longstreet's men chased the Union force across Blackburn's Ford, and Tyler ordered his division to fall back. McDowell was furious. On the rebel front, the mood was joyous. Although less than 150 had been killed or injured in the brief battle at the ford, Beauregard and his men celebrated their victory nonetheless. Beauregard, ever the dreamer, would draft several incomprehensible and ultimately worthless battle plans that evening, but eventually settled on holding the higher ground while reinforcements filed in by rail from Harper's Ferry. The first to arrive were under command of General Thomas Jackson. Jackson, a staunchly Christian man described by his soldiers as stern yet fair, was yet another veteran of the Mexican-American War and had gone on to teach at a prestigious military academy in Virginia. Soon to arrive were Joseph Johnston's troops, who had not been defeated by General Patterson as McDowell had planned. Johnston soon took command after a brief argument with Beauregard. However, the Confederate leadership all agreed on one thing: the battle would have to proceed the following day. They did not want Patterson to catch up and reinforce McDowell. McDowell knew that the Confederate right and center were heavily defended. Therefore, he reasoned that the best course of action should be to feint at the center and target the enemy left flank with everything he could spare. Alongside the Union Army had ridden hundreds of onlookers, some of them prominent Washington politicians and their families. All were eager to see the Northern victory that was surely to await them. Bull Run became known as a picnic battle, due to the leisurely activities of onlookers as the battle began. They gathered in the town of Centerville. "They came in all manner of ways," Artillery Captain John Tidball said. "Some in stylish carriages, others in city hacks, and still others in buggies, on horseback, and even on foot. Apparently, everything in the shape of vehicles in and around Washington had been pressed into service for the occasion." Some onlookers bragged that they would be dining in Richmond the following evening. At 2 a.m. on July 21, 1861, the morning after the skirmish at Blackburn's Ford, General Tyler was called into service once again, attempting to rouse his troops for the attack. They were sluggish, exhausted, and found that the darkness was difficult to maneuver in. As such, It was not until 4 hours later that they were in position. The extreme left of the Confederate line at the Stone Bridge was held by only 1,100 men. They were under the command of Nathan Shanks Evans, a hard-drinking bar fighter who was eager for action. The Louisiana soldiers watched as Union artillery fired over their heads. McDowell himself would lead a column towards the center, although they would be delayed until 9 a.m. by taking a poor route. The Confederate lines were equally disorganized. Beauregard would prove horrible at passing along orders, and often scribbled confusing or contradictory notes for his subordinates. Still, they held their positions and waited for the opportunity to counterattack. Beauregard would make a crucial and decisive decision by ordering 3 brigades to reinforce the vulnerable Stone Bridge. This is where the Union plan began to fall apart, as the flanking attack had been in position and exposed long before the supposed central feint that McDowell was counting on. Rather than risk the ire of McDowell once again, Tyler chose to wait. In that moment, he outnumbered the rebel troops 7-1, but still refused to budge and attack the bridge. The wait grew so arduous that General Evans began to suspect that the attack was a ruse. He waited until a message from Beauregard's chief signal officer arrived. It read simply, "Look to your left, you're turned." Evans left only a token force to defend the bridge, taking up a position on Matthews Hill overlooking open ground that Tyler would have to cross in order to attack. When the Union line advanced 9:15, they came under withering fire from the hill and struggled to counter it. That division's commander, Ambrose Burnside, falsely suspected that the enemy force on Matthews Hill was significantly larger than it was. Such was the effectiveness of Evans' attack. Nathan Evans and his men held the line against a significantly larger Union force for nearly an hour. Confederate reinforcements, some 2,800 men, took position on nearby Henry Hill. It was then that the Confederates decided to launch a counterattack. They leapt into the fray, and the fighting near the Stone Bridge became a close-range melee as bayonets clashed and muskets were fired at point-blank range. In the end, the rebels retreated back up the hill in disarray. It was at 11 o'clock that fresh divisions under S.P. Heintzelman were sent in by General Tyler. McDowell had urged him to press the assault, and with eager troops streaming in, he sought to do just that. But they too were repulsed. General Sherman then joined the attack in full. He had opted to cross a shallow ford to reach the battle for Matthews Hill, and had been forced to leave his artillery behind, but it hardly bothered him. In a moment of uniform confusion, shockingly similar to the one at Blackburn's Ford, Sherman's gray-clad men approached and attacked a regiment of soldiers from Alabama, who initially believed Sherman's soldiers to be reinforcements. As Sherman trudged up the hill towards the Confederate line, the day seemed to be won. The rebel left flank had begun to turn, as McDowell funneled men into the fierce flanking action that had taken the better part of 3 hours. McDowell himself rode among the men, chanting, "Victory! The day is ours!" Beauregard and Johnston dreaded what was to come. They had issued orders to their subordinates that never materialized, and knew it was only a matter of time before Patterson's men arrived to support the Union advance. On the left, Nathan Evans and fellow generals Bee and Bartow were in complete disarray. It was then that Beauregard boldly declared the battle would be decided, riding off to the left and issuing rapid-fire orders to whomever he could reach. The Southerners fought a determined holding action, and were soon joined by General Jackson's Virginian Brigade. The place that Jackson chose to make his stand was excellent, offering cover in obscuring terrain that the Union troops would have to slog through to reach them. Jackson was sick and tired of fighting over long ranges, and when asked his strategy, simply replied, "We'll give them the bayonet." As the Virginians came under fire, the infamous words were uttered, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall." He was joined by Johnston and Beauregard, who set about making preparations for a defense centered around Jackson's line. They reorganized their shattered brigades and came personally under fire. Across the field, so convinced of his victory, McDowell made the worst mistake of his career. Regiment by regiment, the Union line advanced piecemeal, falling under fire of the rebels in their superior defensive position. Rather than sending in entire brigades, McDowell made the baffling choice to stagger his attack in waves, which were each flung back in turn. By 2 p.m., the Union batteries were finally in place for an artillery assault, but were unprepared when their supporting infantry regiments rushed to attack the hill instead. The Union men were cut down by rifle fire, then found themselves set upon by cavalry led by the infamous Jeb Stuart. Still, the waves of Northerners crashed on, line by line, as the rebels slowly gave ground. Yet Jackson was borderline jubilant. A Confederate soldier even said that Jackson's eyes seemed to blaze as the fighting grew fiercer. Confederate troops swung around to the Union artillery batteries, who again mistook them for allies and were overrun. Though the guns were quickly retaken, it was with men that would have been better sent elsewhere. McDowell kept the attacks going for 2 more hours. Wave after wave after wave of men charging into Confederate lines with no regard for their own lives. Jackson would lead several bayonet charges, and as the Union led fresh regiments into the meat grinder, those men would see their predecessors cut down in front of them. Confederates under General Arnold Elzey and Jabal Early then ran straight ahead into the crumbling Union lines, the air filled with the cracking of gunfire and the shrill battle cry soon to be dubbed the Rebel Yell. The Union line broke, first in retreat, then a full-fledged rout. They retreated back the way they came, flooding past the civilians who had come to watch their triumph. At times, they found the road blocked with carriages or horses, and nearly trampled over the onlookers as they ran. A group of soldiers retreated past a few picnicking senators, who attempted to bar their retreat and send them back into the maelstrom. Senator Ben Wade of Ohio even picked up a discarded rifle and threatened to shoot any soldier that fled. They paid him no mind. One congressman, Alfred Ely, had been among those chanting "On to Richmond." He would visit Richmond indeed, spending 5 months as a prisoner of war after being captured by Confederates during the rout. Some of the men on either side had been under fire for close to 8 hours and had been on their feet for nearly 14. The Confederate forces, although their morale was bolstered by victory, could not summon the organization or willpower to take the battle onwards and pursue their defeated enemy. Nearly 400 of them had been killed, and around 1,500 lay wounded. The Federals fared slightly worse, with around 450 killed and 2,000 wounded or captured. The battle had proved to many that war was not going to be glorious, nor was it to be kind or fair. Battles like Bull Run often amounted to wholesale slaughter. When Lincoln received news of the Army's defeat, he was stunned. That November, he dismissed General Winfield Scott and replaced him with the cautious General George McClellan. McClellan would help reorganize the demoralized Army of the Potomac and whip it into shape as a fighting force in the years to come, although his own blunders would see him stripped of the command eventually. The war, thought to be brief, was far from over, and the battle seemed to signify an end to national innocence. No longer was this a mere rebellion to be swept aside, but a true war for the soul of the nation. One that would pit North against South, brother against brother, American against American. Thank you for watching. This is my first attempt at anything remotely similar to this, so I hope it was good, and I hope you learned something. And I picked this battle because it was obviously the one that kicked off the Civil War, other than Fort Sumter, which wasn't really a battle, but and I figured, what better way to kick off a channel that, goes into stuff like this than with something so momentous. I'm definitely going to go over more Civil War stuff in the future, because I enjoyed making this. So I'm going to do World War II, 30 Years' War, Zulu War, all sorts of stuff. So thanks for watching. Cheers.